Have you ever wondered if silence could be more dangerous than words? What if humanity was not created to speak, but to remember in silence? In the heart of the Gobi Desert, a lone traveler crosses into an ancient forbidden zone, where sound dies, reality fractures, and the deepest truths of our existence begin to awaken. What secrets are buried in the silence we fear? What happens when memory itself becomes the deadliest force in the universe? Tonight, we follow Eliot Marrow on a journey beyond space, beyond time, into the crumbling remains of the fifth universe, a place where one word can end everything. Stay with us. What you are about to hear may change the way you look at silence, forever. Eliot Marrow had ventured into deserts before, but nothing had prepared him for the Gobi's endless breath. The sand beneath his boots was not merely ground, it was a shifting skin stretched over an ancient body that still stirred beneath, breathing so slowly that only those who stayed long enough could sense it. The air was thin, the sun a pale, merciless disk hanging above, bleaching color and courage alike from every living thing. Each step he took felt heavier, not because of exhaustion but because the world itself seemed reluctant to let him move forward, as if warning him with a patience born of eternity. As twilight approached, the colors around him did not simply dim, they were devoured. The horizon did not glow with the usual farewell fire but instead collapsed inward, as if the sky itself were being sucked into some unseen abyss. A coldness prickled the surface of his skin, and the pressure in the atmosphere shifted so subtly, so monstrously, that Eliot first thought it was merely in his head until the instruments in his backpack began to fail, one by one. The GPS flickered, spasmed, and went dark. His radio emitted only a strangled static before falling silent. Even the mechanical watch on his wrist ticked slower, as if time itself had begun to resist continuation. He tried to call out, a simple test of sanity, but his voice stumbled out of his throat like a wounded animal and died inches from his mouth. There was no echo, no carrying of sound, the desert swallowed it whole, without even the courtesy of acknowledgement. Fear slithered up his spine, not the sharp, frantic fear of danger, but the deeper, more paralyzing terror that he was no longer recognized by the world around him. And then came the darkness. It did not fall like night, it rose from the ground, a mist of pure blackness that uncoiled from the sands and climbed into the sky. There were no stars. No moon. Not even the ghostly shimmer of distant cities. Only a void, thick and tangible, that pressed against Eliot's skin as though trying to seep into him, to dissolve the fragile boundaries between his body and the endless nothingness. The ground beneath him shuddered, not a quake, but a subtle, living twitch, like the muscle spasm of something vast and buried. Eliot stumbled, his boots slipping in the fine dust, and as he fell to his knees he realized the sand was no longer behaving like sand. It clung to his skin with a damp, cold insistence, and the grains seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing. A low vibration rose from below, not sound but a pressure that resonated within his bones, making him grind his teeth in instinctive dread. Panic gripped him, but so did awe. It was as if the desert had peeled back a layer of itself to reveal a deeper truth. It was not merely landscape but sentient, ancient, and perhaps even hungry. Through the smothering darkness, Eliot spotted something, a faint glow, not of light, but of a paler shade of black, like an oil stain spreading over silk. Drawn to it without understanding why, he forced himself upright and stumbled forward. The desert reshaped itself beneath his feet, each step sinking deeper than the last, the ground pulling at him with the reluctant strength of a place that had waited centuries for a soul foolish enough to wander too far. As he moved closer, shapes began to emerge, towering forms that blurred the line between rock and ruin, their surfaces inscribed with symbols that seemed to squirm when he looked at them too long. A gateway, ancient and broken, loomed before him, half swallowed by the living sands. There was no door, no barrier, only a threshold where the temperature dropped so sharply that Eliot's breath crystallized instantly, hanging before him like ghostly vines. He hesitated at the threshold, feeling the pull of two opposing forces, the primal urge to flee and the deeper compulsion to step forward, into the unknown. Something waited beyond. Not with violence. Not with mercy. But with an emptiness so vast it had become an entity of its own. And in that moment, Eliot understood, he had not merely crossed into a silent zone. He had crossed into the memory of a world that should no longer exist. A forgotten corridor of time, sealed away not by accident but by design. The darkness welcomed him, not as a visitor, but as something long expected. The threshold behind Eliot disappeared the moment he stepped beyond it, swallowed not by distance but by something deeper, a cancellation of existence itself. His boots pressed against a ground that felt neither solid nor liquid, but something in between, a trembling membrane that responded to his every move like a thing alive. He tried to find his bearings, but there were no landmarks, no horizon, no sky, only an endless, dense blackness so profound it seemed to thicken the very air he breathed. Every inhalation tasted like wet iron and old stones, heavy with the memories of forgotten catastrophes. He walked blindly, his hands stretched out before him, but even touch betrayed him. The world was too still. No wind brushed against his skin, no grains of sand grated beneath his soles. Soundless. Weightless. Directionless. Every step felt both momentous and meaningless, a futile struggle against an environment that denied the very rules of existence. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, whispering promises of disintegration, urging him to lie down and surrender to the formlessness. A sudden coldness coiled around his ankle. Eliot froze, heart hammering against the fragile cage of his ribs. He looked down but saw nothing, only darkness, thicker and slicker near the ground. The sensation tightened, pulling at him with an ancient patience, and for a moment he was certain that if he moved even slightly, he would be dragged down into the unseen depths beneath his feet. He shifted his weight slowly, carefully, breaking free of the invisible grip, but not without a price. The ground shuddered in protest, and from the darkness ahead came a soft, wet tearing sound, like flesh parting under a dull blade. He moved faster now, driven by pure instinct, but the space around him grew denser with every step. His limbs ached from pushing through what felt like invisible curtains of pressure. The darkness resisted him, not as a void but as a will, ancient and deliberate, testing his resolve. His lungs burned, not from lack of oxygen but from an oppressive sensation that the very air he inhaled was infused with a slow, seeping intelligence. Shapes began to materialize not with clarity, but as distortions in the fabric of the blackness. Tall, angular forms that bent and twisted in impossible geometries, structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than he could comprehend. They flickered at the edge of his perception, vanishing when he tried to focus on them, leaving behind after images that throbbed in his skull like phantom memories. His mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the wrongness around him, but deep within, some primal part of his being recognized this place. Not as a destination, but as a warning. A vibration rose through the ground, subtle at first, like the distant beat of a great heart, buried beneath layers of dead worlds. It grew stronger, synchronizing with the frantic pulse in his veins. Eliot stumbled, nearly falling to his knees, and as he looked up he realized the darkness itself was moving now, rippling like the surface of a vast, unseen ocean. Something immense was approaching, not with speed, but with inevitability. Ahead, a crack of dim, blood-colored light split the darkness. It did not illuminate, it revealed. The landscape twisted grotesquely in its glow, rivers of ash running uphill, mountains that breathed and shifted as if shrugging off a long sleep. In the distance, silhouetted against that hellish fissure, a structure loomed, a tower of black stone, spiked and broken, its summit lost to the invisible ceiling of this starless world. Drawn by a force he could neither understand nor resist, Eliot moved toward it. Every step closer tore at his senses. His memories unraveled at the edges, details of his life fraying and dissolving like paper submerged in water. Faces of loved ones blurred, the sound of his mother's laughter faded into a meaningless hum, the warmth of sunlight on his childhood skin became an unreachable fiction. In their place surged raw impressions, screaming planets consumed by silence, cities collapsing into the folds of oblivion, entire epochs crushed under the weight of truths too ancient to bear. Eliot stumbled again, falling to his hands and knees, his fingers sinking into the pulsing ground. A voice, not a sound, but a knowing, bloomed inside his head. It spoke without words, pouring concepts directly into the raw nerve endings of his mind. You were never meant to survive here. You were meant to remember. He lifted his gaze to the tower. Its stones bled streams of shadow, pouring into the ground in slow rivulets, as if feeding the sentient desert. Something waited within, patient and ravenous, wrapped in a silence so vast it had become its own kind of gravity. Eliot rose, swaying, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but there was no back anymore. Only forward. Only deeper. He crossed the final threshold, and the darkness behind him closed like a wound, erasing all trace of the world he had known. And ahead, the night without stars held its breath. There was no sound, no wind, no shift in the air, yet Eliot felt movement all around him. It was the kind of movement that lived in the corner of perception, sensed not through sight or hearing but through the ancient instincts buried deep within his blood. Each step he took forward pressed against an invisible barrier, as if reality itself had thickened into layers he must wade through. Breathing became a laborious act, and even the rhythm of his heartbeat seemed muffled, as though it struggled to exist in a place that had long ago outlawed life. The darkness ahead changed subtly, growing denser, more tangible. He no longer merely walked through it, he pushed against it, fought it, as if swimming through the ashes of dead worlds. Shapes began to emerge, not forms of stone or earth, but anomalies of space itself. At first, just flickers, twisted eddies in the blackness that coiled and recoiled when approached, like living shadows aware of his presence. Then structures, vast, crumbling monuments, half swallowed by the dark sands, standing silent and blind like ancient sentinels forgotten by time. His body responded before his mind could understand. Every hair on his arms bristled, his muscles tensed without conscious command. Something unseen was watching him, not with eyes, but with a pressure that crawled under his skin, probing, weighing, measuring. Each step into the zone of silence was a negotiation with forces that neither welcomed nor rejected him. They simply acknowledged him, the way one might notice a fleeting disturbance in an otherwise still pond. The ground changed beneath his boots. What once was coarse sand turned into something finer, colder, whispering against his solace with a susurrus that echoed directly inside his mind, bypassing his ears. He could hear thoughts that were not his own, fragmented memories of civilizations lost to the sands, silent screams of beings who had crossed into this forbidden place and never returned. A low vibration trembled through the solace of his feet. It wasn't seismic, it was rhythmic, deliberate. A pulse. A heartbeat. Something immense and ancient, buried beneath the zone, alive and aware of his intrusion. The darkness began to throb in time with the vibration, breathing around him, exhaling invisible clouds of despair and ancient sorrow. Eliot stumbled as a vision assaulted him, not a dream, not a hallucination, but a memory injected into his consciousness. He saw towering spires of glass and bone, reaching into a sky cracked by tendrils of black fire. He saw rivers of silver blood carving canyons through fields of white ash. He saw the stars falling, not like meteors, but like dying gods, each collapse punctuated by a silence so profound it devoured not only sound but meaning itself. The vision shattered with a soundless snap, and Eliot gasped, falling to one knee. His hands sank into the fine dust, which clung to his skin with a leech-like hunger. Every grain seemed to vibrate, whispering to him in a language older than memory, a language meant not to be spoken, but absorbed. He understood now why this place was forbidden, why the ancients had buried it beneath layers of myth and fear. The zone of silence was not a place at all, it was a wound, an open scar on the fabric of the universe where the rules of reality had bled out long ago. Something stirred ahead. A ripple in the dark, growing, swelling, taking form. It was not a creature. It was not a machine. It was a concept made manifest, a sentinel born from the collapse of forgotten worlds, its presence a warning and a prison both. It moved without moving, unfolding itself from the folds of the darkness, and though it had no eyes, Eliot felt its gaze pierce through every layer of his being, reaching down into the deepest secrets he had ever tried to forget. He tried to step back, but his body no longer responded to will alone. His muscles were strings pulled by unseen hands, his thoughts a playground for ancient forces far beyond human comprehension. The thing spoke not with words, but with a slow, crushing certainty that invaded his mind. You were called. You will witness. You will not speak. The weight of the command pressed him to the ground. His face buried in the dust, Eliot struggled against the tidal force of the entity's will. His breath shuddered, his heart threatened to rupture under the pressure, but some small, stubborn fragment of his humanity, raw and feral, clawed itself free and forced him to lift his head. He would not surrender. Not yet. Ahead, the entity retreated slightly, folding itself back into the currents of the darkness, satisfied for now, waiting for him to move deeper into the trap it had so carefully set. Eliot rose on trembling legs. There was no turning back. Only the path forward, deeper into the silence, deeper into the nightmare that had no name. And overhead, the night without stars watched in patient, terrible silence. The silence was no longer absence, it had become a force, heavy and thick, grinding against Eliot's skin as he staggered deeper into the zone. The air vibrated with a low, predatory hum, so deep that it bypassed his ears and rattled directly through his bones. Every breath tasted of rust and forgotten tombs. His mind reeled under the pressure of an atmosphere that seemed designed to strip away reason, peeling consciousness down to its most primitive core. Shapes flickered at the edges of perception, shadows that melted and reformed with every blink, forms that mocked the idea of solidity. No horizon offered guidance, no landmarks broke the suffocating sameness. It was not simply darkness, it was the erasure of existence itself, a grinding blankness that wore down willpower with the slow inevitability of erosion. Eliot pressed onward, each step a battle against gravity, as if the ground sought to reclaim him with jealous hands. And then he heard it, the first whisper. It slithered across the inside of his skull, a voice without sound, a suggestion without words. Not a call, not a command, something more insidious. An invitation. A thread tugging at the frayed edges of his consciousness, beckoning him to listen, to remember. He froze, muscles locking in place as the whisper thickened into a chorus, multiple voices, rising and falling in chaotic harmonies, weaving a tapestry of sound stitched from forgotten sorrows and ancient longings. The voices did not speak a language he recognized, but their meaning was unmistakable. Images flooded his mind, too rapid, too visceral to block out: towers of ice crumbling under a sunless sky, rivers of black glass shattering into fractal storms, countless eyes blinking open within the cracks of a dying world. Each vision carried with it a residue of despair, a hunger so vast it made his own fear seem pitiful by comparison. The ground beneath Eliot shifted again, subtly at first, then with a sickening lurch that threw him to his knees. The surface pulsed like the flesh of a dreaming behemoth, and from the cracks oozed a mist so dense it seemed to bleed light from the air itself. The mist coiled around him, caressing his skin with fingers colder than death, and where it touched, numbness spread, leaching away sensation until he could no longer tell where his body ended and the desert began. Through the mist, he saw them. Figures. Neither fully material nor entirely spectral, they stood in a rough circle around him, tall, thin, their outlines flickering like candle flames in a gale. Their faces were masks of smooth, featureless darkness, yet Eliot felt their gazes drilling into him, stripping away lies and pretenses, laying bare the raw, trembling soul beneath. He tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey. Fear rooted him in place, a marionette dangling on unseen strings. The whispers grew louder, threading themselves into coherent phrases now, though still warped by an alien cadence. Keeper of silence. Bearer of the forgotten oath. Witness to the fifth collapse. The words clawed at his mind, each syllable embedding itself like a hook, dragging buried memories to the surface, memories not his own. He saw himself standing at the edge of a vast abyss, stars dying overhead, civilizations crumbling into dust, and always the silence growing, consuming, hungering. A hand, or something like it, extended toward him from the nearest figure. Its fingers were too long, too thin, joints bending in ways that defied natural anatomy. At its tip hung a shard of obsidian, perfectly black, perfectly still, absorbing all light around it. Eliot knew, without understanding how, that to touch it would be to accept to take into himself a burden older than time, to become part of whatever machinery had been set in motion here. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse. But somewhere deeper, beneath the fear, beneath even the desperate clinging to his humanity, a different voice murmured, "You have already begun." He reached out, trembling, and as his fingertips brushed the shard, a shock of cold so absolute it felt like the cessation of existence surged through him. His vision inverted, light became darkness, sound became silence, past and future twisted into a Mobius loop without end. And then, from within his very cells, the true whispering began. Not external now. Not from the mist, nor the figures, nor the ground. From within him. A language he had never learned but had always somehow known. A command older than flesh. A truth too terrible for any sane mind to carry. The fifth collapse had not ended. It was merely sleeping. And through him, it had begun to stir. The whispering never truly stopped. It retreated beneath the surface of Eliot's mind, a ceaseless, coiling presence threading through every thought, every heartbeat. As he staggered forward, the figures dissolved into the mist, their outlines breaking apart like smoke in a high wind, leaving behind only a charged emptiness, as if the very atoms of the air buzzed with expectation. He was alone again, or rather, he was the only thing that still recognized itself as alone. Everything else, every grain of dust, every tremor beneath his feet, every shiver in the suffocating dark, was awake now, aware of him in ways that transcended vision or sound. The ground ahead shifted unnaturally. What had once been chaotic terrain of uneven dunes and broken stone now reformed into a path not paved, not constructed, but suggested, woven into the folds of the desert itself by forces that understood geometry in a way human minds could only flail at. The path shimmered faintly, only visible at the corner of the eye, slipping away whenever he tried to focus on it directly. It was not a road meant for sight, it was a memory encoded in the bones of the earth, waiting for one foolish or desperate enough to walk it. Eliot hesitated at its threshold. The air here was colder, sharper, carrying with it the taste of ancient promises broken and remade. His body ached with exhaustion, his nerves frayed to the point of raw instinct, yet some deeper part of him understood with chilling certainty, there was no other way. The zone had closed behind him, sealing his past like a tomb. The only escape was forward, into the path unseen. As he placed one foot onto the path, a subtle shift occurred. The sand around him sighed, a low, mournful exhalation that vibrated through the solace of his boots and into the marrow of his bones. Reality thinned further, peeling back layers like rotted fabric, revealing glimpses of a world that existed parallel to his own, shimmering in silent agony. He saw cities suspended in frozen collapse, towers crumbling in eternal slow motion, faces turned skyward in silent screams that would never reach living ears. Each step forward unraveled another thread of the thin protection that had shielded his mind. The whispers grew bolder now, no longer merely coiling within him but rising like a tide, whispering names, dates, memories from lives he had never lived, histories of civilizations that had been erased so thoroughly they no longer existed even as myth. He stumbled, clutching at his head as fragments of alien wars, betrayals, ascensions, and apocalypses tore through his mind in jagged flashes. The path twisted ahead, coiling into impossible angles, leading him through arches formed of petrified shadows and bridges spun from frozen lightning. He crossed a canyon that wasn't there, its bottomless maw yawning beneath his feet, filled not with darkness but with the absence of even the idea of light. He moved through fields of statues, figures locked mid-scream, mid-flee, mid-prayer, some human, some not, their forms eroded not by time but by the mercy of oblivion. Midway along the path, the ground trembled violently. A soundless roar ripped through the mist, and from the unseen spaces between heartbeats, something massive began to emerge. It did not walk, did not slither, did not fly, it simply was, unfolding into being like a concept too large to be contained by physical dimensions. Its form was wrong, shifting through geometries that battered the edges of Eliot's sanity with every glance. Jagged limbs of mist and bone, mouths that opened not to speak but to consume silence itself, eyes that blinked sidewise through layers of unreality. The thing was not a guardian of the path, it was a symptom of it, a byproduct of the collapse that had birthed this fractured reality. It sensed him. It knew him. And worse, it recognized something within him, a sliver of the forbidden truth he now carried like a splinter in his soul. Eliot ran. He did not remember willing his body to move, but primal terror propelled him forward. The path blurred beneath him, twisting and buckling, trying to betray his every step. The mist thickened, clutching at his legs, slowing him, whispering his name in the voices of those he had lost and those he had yet to lose. Behind him, the entity surged, not with rage, but with the inexorable hunger of a thing fulfilling its ancient purpose. Distance meant nothing here, it was not chasing him through space but through memory, through identity, devouring the very concept of Eliot Marrow with every passing heartbeat. He stumbled, fell, rolled hard against the ground, and as he scrambled to rise, the path mercifully, impossibly split into three directions, each leading into denser darkness, each vibrating with a different, terrible resonance. He had no time to think. Trusting instincts he barely understood, Eliot plunged into the leftmost path. As he disappeared into the folds of deeper shadow, he heard, not with his ears but with the trembling of his soul, a final whisper from the entity left behind. You cannot outrun what you carry. The path narrowed until it was no longer a trail but a wound cut into the very fabric of the world, a gash that bled mist and silence. Eliot moved through it like a man wading into deep, black waters, each step a battle against the unseen currents that sought to drag him back into the heart of forgetting. His senses twisted in betrayal, distance lost meaning, size fluctuated wildly. At times the corridor loomed vast as a cathedral, at others it pressed against him like the throat of a dying beast. And then, without transition, the path ended. Before him rose the temple. It was not built from stone or metal, but from folds of space and memory, woven together into towering pillars that seemed both ancient and unborn. The walls shimmered, surfaces bending inward in impossible geometries, as if reflecting not the world outside but the decaying dreams of civilizations long consumed. The air buzzed with a low, maddening hum, a vibration that thrummed not through the ears but through the very blood of whoever dared approach. At the heart of the structure stood a gateway, vast and jagged, its edges crumbling into dust that reassembled itself endlessly, never whole, never broken. Symbols pulsated along the surface of the gateway, glyphs that shifted and crawled like living things, rearranging themselves according to some forgotten syntax. Eliot's eyes burned just looking at them, as if they branded meaning directly into his brain without his consent. An immense pressure built around him, an invisible hand pressing down harder with every heartbeat, as if the temple itself demanded a sacrifice before allowing passage. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the path had long since closed behind. The desert, the mist, even the twisted memory of the world he came from, all had been left behind, consumed by the silent hunger of this place. He stepped forward. The ground beneath his feet was not solid but a dense weave of collapsed possibilities, each step causing ripples that radiated outward into the dark. As he crossed the threshold into the temple, the atmosphere changed violently. The silence was no longer simply the absence of sound, it had density now, weight, a crushing, palpable force that squeezed his lungs and slowed the frantic beating of his heart to a sluggish, echoing thud. Pillars loomed into the gloom, each one etched with scenes of worship and ruin. Figures knelt before beings without faces, offering up artifacts, blood, memories. Some of the scenes moved when he looked away, rearranging themselves into new, more terrible configurations. The message was clear: nothing here remained static, even memory could rot and turn against those who carried it. A corridor stretched ahead, lined with shallow alcoves, each containing a relic or fragment, a child's skull embedded with tiny runes, a blade too thin to exist, a jar filled with whispering dust. Eliot moved past them, feeling their collective gaze crawl across his skin, leaving trails of numbness wherever they touched. At the end of the corridor stood a dais, upon which floated a sphere of perfect void. It was not black, it was absence itself, a wound in reality that swallowed light, thought, even hope. As he approached, the whispering in his mind rose into a deafening roar of silent command. He understood without needing to be told: this was not merely a temple. It was a prison. A seal. And it was weakening. The sphere pulsed once slow, deliberate, and the entire temple responded like a living organism, its walls flexing, its pillars groaning under the strain of forgotten oaths. Cracks began to spiderweb across the surfaces, leaking thin streams of black mist that twisted into grotesque shapes before dissipating into nothingness. Eliot stood frozen before the sphere, his body trembling with the effort of resisting the pull. Every cell screamed at him to touch it, to complete the cycle, to tear open the wound fully and unleash whatever ancient hunger had been bound here since the twilight of the fifth universe. But deeper than fear, deeper than awe, something else stirred within him: recognition. This place had been built not to protect humanity from the entity imprisoned within. It had been built to protect the entity from humanity. Because what slept inside the sphere was not evil. It was memory. Raw, pure, and utterly indifferent to survival. A memory of a universe where language had shattered the stars, where names had become weapons, where silence had been the only salvation. And Eliot was no longer merely a visitor. He was the vessel chosen to carry it back into a world that had long forgotten why silence had once been sacred. The sphere pulsed again, closer this time, hungrier. And Eliot stepped forward. When Eliot's hand finally touched the sphere, there was no flash, no explosion, no scream, only a terrible stillness that snapped the universe into silence sharper than any blade. The world around him blurred, its forms bleeding into each other as if the very idea of separation between objects had been revoked. Space folded inwards, and Eliot fell not downward, but inward, spiraling through the collapsing corridors of forgotten realities. Memories not his own slammed into him, each one a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his mind. He staggered through visions that overlapped and clashed, each demanding dominance: an ocean boiling beneath a crimson sky, cities grown from living metal, beings of light and sorrow raising monuments to dead gods. His own memories fought back, desperate to maintain their fragile dominion, but they were swept aside like cobwebs before a rising storm. He tried to scream, but the sound died unborn in his throat. The temple dissolved around him, replaced by an endless plain of black sand under a cracked, hemorrhaging sky. Towers twisted like bone spires clawed at the heavens, and rivers of silver fire cut through the ground, weeping smoke that formed words in languages too old for even sorrow. In the distance, he saw them, echoes of himself, endless versions of Eliot Marrow stretched across the landscape like broken reflections on a shattered mirror. Some wandered aimlessly, mouths open in silent wails, others stood rooted to the spot, their skin cracked and flaking away like ash. A few stared directly at him, eyes hollow, accusatory, as if blaming him for a crime too ancient to name. They moved in unnatural jerks, marionettes dancing to a forgotten rhythm, and the ground trembled under the weight of their collective despair. Eliot stumbled forward, unable to tear his gaze away. With every step, he absorbed fragments of their memories, their regrets, their betrayals. He saw himself abandoning friends to die on alien shores, choosing silence over truth, letting civilizations crumble because to act would have been too terrible. He saw decisions he had never made, lives he had never lived, yet somehow knew intimately, as if possibility itself had bloomed and withered within him countless times before. The whispers returned, louder now, layered so densely that they became a roar inside his skull. You are not one. You are all that was and all that will fail again. You carry the seed of silence. You carry the end. Remember. Pain lanced through his mind, white-hot and merciless. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the ground beneath him pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The sand around him writhed, coalescing into tendrils that reached for his body, caressing and binding, pulling him downward. He fought, but the strength in his limbs faltered, not from weakness but from the overwhelming certainty that resistance was meaningless. He was not a traveler. He was not even a man anymore. He was a vessel, a repository for a memory too vast, too lethal to be contained. And yet buried deep within the tidal wave of horror there was a thread of something else. A question. A choice. The whispers tried to drown it, but he clung to it, desperate, the way a dying man clutches at the final breath. Would he allow himself to become merely a messenger of ruin? A mindless echo of ancient collapse? Or could he by force of will alone reshape the memory into something else? Hope. Defiance. The figures of himself watched in silence, their fates hanging in balance with his choice. He forced himself upright, every muscle screaming in protest, and took a single step forward. The plane shuddered. The echoes of himself blurred, staggered, and for a moment, just a moment, the landscape flickered, revealing not ruin, but the faintest outline of a path, narrow and treacherous, leading toward a distant mountain shrouded in clouds the color of blood. He understood. This was not simply about carrying memory. It was about choosing which memory would survive. The silence had not chosen him. He had chosen the silence. A terrible sound cracked the sky overhead, not thunder, not music, but the sound of a world breathing out after holding its breath for eons. Eliot began to run. And behind him, the broken reflections screamed. The ground beneath Eliot trembled with a deep, rhythmic pulse, like the dying heartbeat of a forgotten god. The air thickened, saturated with unseen currents that pressed against his skin, forcing him to move as if through layers of half-solid mist. Every breath dragged knives of cold into his lungs, every blink risked losing sight of the fragile path unfolding before him, a path that seemed spun from the unraveling threads of reality itself. The sky, if it could still be called that, bled slow rivers of crimson light, casting the broken landscape into an endless twilight where shadows moved with a mind of their own. In the distance, something stirred, a presence vast enough to reshape the world by existing alone, awakening after an eternity of slumber. The Oracle. It did not approach as a being would. It did not step, did not fly, did not grow closer by any human measure. Instead, it unfolded layer by impossible layer, like a storm blooming backwards from the heart of a dead star. Shapes formed and dissolved in its wake, geometries that defied reason, faces that flickered between mercy and malevolence, hands that grasped at concepts rather than matter. Eliot stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to fall to his knees, to avert his gaze, to submit, but he did not. Whether from stubborn defiance or the simple absence of alternatives, he remained upright, facing the oncoming nightmare with empty hands and a heart hammering loud enough to shatter his ribs. When the Oracle spoke, it was not through sound. Its voice existed beyond hearing, beyond thought. It was a restructuring of reality itself, a resonance that twisted the marrow of his bones and rewrote the patterns of his blood. You seek meaning, it said, not in words, but in the collapse of certainty itself. You carry memory, but have not yet earned understanding. There is a cost. Eliot tried to respond, but his mouth refused to form words. He could only nod, a tiny, defiant motion against the crushing gravity of the Oracle's presence. The ground between them cracked, splitting open to reveal an abyss filled not with fire or stone, but with endless reflections, millions of possible versions of Eliot, each living out different destinies, each shaped by choices he had not yet made. Some stood victorious atop ruined worlds, others rotted in cages spun from regret. Some screamed, clawing at invisible barriers. A few knelt in silent surrender, their faces hollowed by the weight of unbearable truths. One question, the Oracle pulsed. One answer. No lies. No forgetting. The choice was not optional. From the swirling abyss, a single thread of possibility rose, thin, fragile, pulsing with pale light. It hovered before Eliot, humming with a frequency that sang directly to the deepest parts of him, to the secret fears and hopes he had never dared voice. The Oracle's question was simple. And terrible. Which will you serve, silence or memory? Eliot understood instantly. Silence, to preserve, to contain, to seal away the collapse at the cost of all future voices. Memory, to release, to bear witness, to risk the unraveling of everything for the sake of truth. The abyss churned hungrily beneath him, each possibility writhing, demanding. Time fractured. He saw himself answering both ways, saw the consequences unfold across dead worlds, saw empires fall and rise, saw himself become both savior and destroyer, sometimes in the same breath. Tears blurred his vision, but he did not wipe them away. This was the weight of choice. This was the price of awakening. With a trembling hand, Eliot reached toward the thread of light. And chose. The oracle did not react with anger or joy. It simply watched. And as Eliot touched the thread, the world shattered, falling inward like a dying sun. And he fell with it, into a place where memory and silence were no longer separate, but one and the same. There was no landing, no impact. Eliot simply existed now, adrift within a vastness that defied all laws of distance and direction. Around him spiraled 1,000 fractured worlds, each spinning slowly into oblivion, tethered by strands of memory so fragile they shivered at his mere gaze. The air or whatever medium sustained him buzzed with a low, aching resonance, the mournful song of civilizations ground into dust by forces they had unleashed but never understood. Above and below, left and right, time unfolded like a torn scroll, revealing scenes burned into the very fabric of forgotten realities. Eliot drifted through them, each vision slicing into his mind with surgical precision. He saw towering cities built from the bones of dead stars, monuments to ambition carved in the light of cannibal suns. He saw beings of brilliant intellect and impossible beauty, gathered in cathedrals spun from crystallized thought, speaking words of binding, words of creation. He saw the air itself shimmer with their utterances, weaving existence tighter with every syllable. And then he saw the unraveling. It began not with war or plague or decay, but with speech. A word spoken out of turn. A phrase too complex, too vast, a song that resonated beyond the boundaries of the worlds that birthed it. Reality buckled under the weight of meaning it could not contain. The intricate lattice of creation shivered, then cracked. Structures of thought collapsed. Stars bled from wounds torn by careless voices. The sky became a wound, oozing rivers of molten language that drowned entire galaxies in the paradox of self-awareness. The beings, the architects of this collapse, screamed, but their screams only deepened the wounds, for in this place, even despair had the power to reshape reality. They tried to silence themselves, binding their own tongues, severing their minds, but it was too late. The fifth universe, once a symphony of perfect complexity, fell inward, folding itself into an ever-tightening spiral of madness and silence. Eliot watched it all, unable to look away, his mind stretched thin across the ancient agony of a reality devouring itself. The oracle's voice rose again, not from outside, but from within him, vibrating through the marrow of his being. This is the price of knowing. This is the legacy of voices unchained. You carry their memory now, their guilt, their hunger. Beneath him, the visions shifted, condensing into a landscape of ruins so vast they swallowed the horizon. Black towers slumped against sickly yellow skies. Oceans of glass sprawled across broken continents. In the distance, immense statues once proud, now eroded into monstrous parodies of themselves, stood vigil over the silence they had failed to preserve. And scattered among the ruins, half buried in the shifting dust, were relics, artifacts of power and despair, cracked orbs humming with dead languages, shattered tablets that bled whispers into the void, machines that no longer served any function but to mourn their creators. Eliot felt himself being drawn toward one such artifact, a twisted spiral of metal and bone, thrumming with a cold, hypnotic pulse. As he neared it, a pulse of memory slammed into him, not words, not images, but pure, unfiltered sorrow. He staggered, gasping, as an alien consciousness brushed against his own, desperate to share its story before fading completely. He saw a world where speaking a child's name could rewrite their future into oblivion. He saw lovers whispering promises that shattered the moons above them. He saw rulers shouting decrees that erased entire histories with a syllable. He saw the final moments, where silence was no longer a choice, but the only mercy left. The oracle pulsed within him, a tide rising with terrible inevitability. The fifth fell because they forgot the sanctity of silence. They believed all knowledge must be spoken, all truths must be heard. They tore themselves apart with words sharper than any blade. The truth settled over Eliot like a shroud. The silence he had stumbled into was not an accident. It was a refuge. A quarantine. A tomb for a memory too dangerous to ever awaken fully. And now, by his mere presence, by his mere curiosity, he had begun to lift the seals placed at such terrible cost. A choice awaited him, still burning brighter and more terrible with every step he took deeper into the heart of this forbidden remembrance. Would he carry the memory back into a world unprepared for its weight? Or would he silence himself forever, sealing the knowledge within the void where it belonged? The ruins stretched endlessly before him, each broken tower and shattered relic a silent monument to a single truth. Not all knowledge was meant to survive. And not all memories deserved to be remembered. The ruins blurred and bled into darkness as Eliot stumbled forward, his mind writhing under the weight of truths too vast for any single consciousness to bear. His body felt thin, stretched across unseen plains, his heart a distant drum echoing through hollow corridors of memory and fear. Above him, the sky shattered further, cracks radiating like spiderwebs across the dome of reality, each fissure leaking thin streams of formless color that hissed as they met the poisoned air. The oracle waited. It no longer loomed as a towering entity but permeated everything around him: the mist, the ground, the trembling horizon. It spoke without sound, weaving itself into the very structure of Eliot's thoughts, bypassing resistance, fusing message with memory. You wonder why your kind was shaped from the dust of stars and the breath of void. You wonder why you sing, why you weep, why you scream into the cold expanse and hear no answer. The ground beneath Eliot cracked, fractures racing outward in all directions, and from those wounds emerged the echo of millions of voices, not speaking, not calling, but humming. A vibration of regret, a chorus of silence barely broken, trembling on the edge of awakening. You were not made to speak. Visions flooded him. He saw Earth, small and fragile, a green-blue jewel cradled against the emptiness. He saw its birth, its ancient seas, its blind creatures crawling from the abyss. And he saw the hand, not a physical hand, but an intention, an act of cosmic desperation reaching across impossible distances to seed the world with a new kind of life. Not warriors. Not thinkers. Not builders. Vessels. Beings created with mouths that could speak but hearts that were designed to remember in silence. Minds that could hold memory without releasing it into the dangerous currents of utterance. Bodies tuned to carry the last, dying song of a universe too broken to sing it aloud. You were made to carry the silence. You are not the first. You will not be the last. The air around Eliot thickened as the first tremors of awakening rippled outward. He felt it, the subtle shift of vibrations traveling back along the thread that tethered him to Earth. Something ancient and buried deep within humanity stirred, responding to his presence here, to the breaking of the seals. At first, it was faint, a low, pulsing hum hidden beneath the noise of existence. the murmur of restless dreams, the tremble of forgotten instincts. Then it grew stronger, branching through the collective consciousness of humanity like a crack racing through glass. He heard it, a whisper rising from distant cities, from sleeping fields, from the depths of oceans and the peaks of mountains. A wordless sound, a hunger, a remembering. A danger. The oracle's presence pressed closer, its voice no longer gentle but hard and final. You have awakened the seed. If it flowers, the silence will fracture. Memory will spill into the world like a poison without antidote. Your kind will not survive it. Scenes unfurled before him like broken banners in a storm, cities melting into tides of molten memory, minds collapsing under the unbearable weight of remembrance, entire continents silenced not by war but by the reawakening of truths too vast for survival. Eliot dropped to his knees, hands pressed against the trembling earth, breathing in the scent of dust and endings. He understood now. Humanity had been trusted with the greatest burden of all, not to discover, not to create, but to protect by not speaking, by not remembering, by holding the silence sacred against the endless hunger of the past. And he had broken that trust. The oracle did not judge him. It merely observed, as it had observed countless times before, as civilizations rose and fell like sparks against the infinite night. There was still a choice. But the longer he hesitated, the more the whispering grew, threading itself into the hearts of those who slept, planting seeds of madness that would bloom into apocalypse. The silence demanded a sacrifice. Not of words, but of himself. Only by sealing the memory within his own being, locking it away where no voice could reach, could he hope to prevent the collapse. Only by becoming the final guardian of the forbidden silence. And somewhere far away, on a world that had never truly been his own, humanity stirred in its sleep, standing on the precipice of a dawn that might never come. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy, thick with a density that pressed against Eliot's chest like a hand trying to crush the air from his lungs. Beneath his feet, the ground trembled in slow, agonized pulses, each vibration carrying the weight of 1,000 broken promises, 1,000 collapsed worlds. The sky above wept thin streams of silver mist, threads of memory leaking from the cracks in reality, each one whispering forgotten names into the endless void. And in the distance, closer now, the whispers of earth grew louder. Eliot heard them at first indistinct, a murmur like wind through dead leaves. But as he listened, the sounds sharpened, shaped into voices he knew too well. His mother's laugh, warm and trembling. His father's stern but loving call. The quiet, hopeful voice of a friend he had lost to time and distance. The voice of a woman he had once loved, soft and breaking with unspoken words. His own voice, fractured and desperate, calling from some unseen corner of himself. They did not accuse. They did not beg. They simply reached for him, a tapestry of longing and memory too vast to contain. And in those calls, Eliot felt the unbearable weight of what would be lost if he chose wrong. The oracle pulsed within him, silent but inexorable, its presence now a storm of knowledge waiting to be unleashed. He stood at the threshold, the final gate between oblivion and survival, between remembering and forgetting. Every fiber of his being screamed for action, but action itself had become a razor balanced over the throat of existence. If he spoke, if he let even a single syllable of the forbidden memory escape, it would spread like wildfire through the fragile minds of humanity, unraveling thought, identity, reality itself. Cities would burn without flame. Time would stutter and collapse into itself. Humanity would die, not with screams, but with a silence so deep it would erase their very having ever been. But if he sealed it, if he bound the memory inside himself forever, he would become a prisoner of it, a tomb for a dying universe's last breath. He would walk the world as a hollow shell, carrying within him the unspoken end of all things, never able to share the truth, never able to lighten the unbearable weight. The voices called to him again, closer now, weaving through the cracks in his mind. Eliot, come back. Don't leave us. We are waiting. Tears blurred his vision, but he could not wipe them away. His arms hung heavy at his sides, as if the very gravity of this moment sought to pin him down, to bury him in indecision. The oracle's final words poured into him, not as command but as simple, terrible truth. Choice births destruction. Choice births salvation. You are the fulcrum. The sky split open overhead, a gaping wound bleeding the light of unborn stars. Through the rupture, Eliot glimpsed flashes of futures, some filled with hope, others with desolation so complete it rendered hope obscene. He had no guarantee. No certainty. Only the burden of choice. And still the voices called. Straining against the tidal pull of memory, Eliot forced his body forward, one agonizing step at a time, toward the swirling core of the collapsing silence. Every step stripped away another layer of himself, fears, loves, dreams, until he stood naked before the void, a flickering ember in a storm without end. He reached out, his hand trembling not from weakness, but from the unbearable magnitude of what he was about to do. He chose silence. Not because he wanted to. Not because he believed he deserved salvation. But because he understood, some truths were not meant to be spoken. Some memories were mercies when forgotten. The silence accepted him. It swallowed his screams, his regrets, his hopes. And somewhere, far away, the voices faded into the hush of a world that would never know how close it had come to ceasing to be. Eliot Marrow became the keeper, the warden of silence, and the last witness to the death of the fifth universe. The silence Eliot carried was not a burden he wore upon his back, it was a weight stitched into his very soul, a gravitational collapse of memory and sorrow pulling at the edges of his being with every faltering breath. He moved now not through space, but through layers of broken realities, slipping between the folds of a universe that no longer fully accepted his existence. The world around him was strange, a patchwork of half-formed landscapes stitched together by memory and decay. Skies of inverted oceans loomed overhead, while valleys carved themselves out of living shadows. The ground pulsed faintly beneath his boots, whispering promises in tongues that no longer had meaning. And in the distance, something stirred. A flicker at first, then a steady presence, growing bolder with each heartbeat. It was not like the oracle. It did not radiate ancient sorrow or burdened wisdom. No, this presence buzzed with a different energy, sharp, hungry, alive. It resonated with the thin threads of the forbidden knowledge Eliot now carried, sniffing them out across the dead air like a predator scenting blood. They were coming. He had no name for them, but instinct clawed at his mind, scavengers of memory, parasites of collapsed truths, entities born from the echoes of fallen universes. They hunted the silence not to preserve it, but to break it open, to gorge themselves upon the forbidden knowledge it contained, to reignite the fires that had once burned entire realities to ash. The first of them emerged from the mist, a figure shrouded in a cloak of tattered reflections, faces flickering across its surface like trapped souls. It moved without sound, gliding over the breathing ground, eyes hidden, but gaze palpable, pinning Eliot in place with a weight colder than the void itself. Behind it, more came. A procession of broken forms, each twisted by the hunger they carried, each vibrating with the unbearable tension of minds stretched too far, too thin. They did not speak. They did not need to. The offer was clear. Surrender the silence. unbind the memory, taste the forbidden knowledge for himself. In the center of the procession floated an object, a shard of pure thought, crackling with raw, untamed information. It pulsed in rhythm with Eliot's heartbeat, promising revelation, power, freedom from the crushing burden he now bore. Within it swirled the secrets of the fifth collapse, how it had begun, why it had failed, and how, perhaps, it could be reborn. All he had to do was reach out. All he had to do was speak. The ground trembled beneath him, cracks opening like mouths gasping for air. From the fissures rose whispers, fragmented memories of voices lost to time, chanting in broken harmonies that tugged at his mind, pulling at the stitches of silence he had sewn into his soul. He staggered, knees buckling under the weight of temptation. Images flashed before him, visions of himself standing atop new worlds, reshaping existence with the raw power of forbidden truths, remaking reality in his image. He saw adoration, dominion, transcendence. And then he saw ruin. The same endless spiral of collapse, history devouring itself in an Ouroboros of despair. The entities pressed closer now, the shard of knowledge floating inches from his outstretched hand. The air thickened, saturated with the electric scent of imminent choice. The oracle's final echo stirred within him, faint but unwavering. The path to truth is paved with the bones of those who could not bear it. Eliot clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms until blood welled up, grounding him in the brutal certainty of his choice. He would not be another link in the chain of collapse. With a cry born not from weakness but from unyielding defiance, he turned away from the shard, away from the scavengers, away from the endless temptation of knowledge unearned. The entities shrieked not in sound, but in a tearing of the fabric of the world itself as he rejected them. The shard cracked, splintering into 1,000 screams of lost possibilities, and the ground beneath the procession collapsed into a chasm of writhing oblivion. Eliot ran. Not from fear, but toward the only thing that mattered now. The silence. The fragile, precious silence he had sworn to protect. Behind him, the scavengers howled in voiceless rage, fading into the mist, but Eliot did not look back. He would carry the burden. He would carry the silence. No matter the cost. The silence had weight, a crushing presence that clung to Eliot's skin like invisible chains, grinding against his bones with every faltering step. The world around him no longer resembled any place he had ever known. It twisted and recoiled, folding into itself and blooming outward in impossible geometries, as if reality were struggling to contain the burden he now carried. Colors bled into each other in ways that defied human sight, and the sky, if it could still be called that, pulsed with a heartbeat that was not his own. Inside the cocoon of silence he bore, something shifted. At first, it was a tremor, subtle and easily ignored, the natural fatigue of a mind stretched to its limit. But it grew. Beneath the heavy hush, a thread of thought began to unravel, a whisper from within rather than without. His own voice. Soft, persuasive, insidious. "You have done enough," it murmured. "You have carried the burden farther than anyone before you. You deserve peace." Eliot clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, drawing blood that dripped into the broken ground. He tried to drown out the voice, to force it back into the vault of fear and sacrifice he had built within himself. But it was clever. It knew his weaknesses, his doubts, his buried desires. What if there is another way? What if you could release it just a little, just enough to ease the weight? Would that not be mercy? The landscape mirrored his crumbling resolve. The cracked ground split wider, gaping fissures revealing glimpses of futures that twisted and writhed like dying serpents. Towers of ash collapsed into themselves. Rivers of shattered glass boiled under unseen suns. Figures half-formed, half-forgotten watched from the shadows, their hollow eyes brimming with a hunger Eliot recognized all too well, the hunger for release. He stumbled forward, but the terrain fought him. Each step became heavier, his own body rebelling against the will that had driven him this far. The silence inside him seethed, a living storm pressing outward against the fragile barriers of his soul, desperate for escape. And still the voice whispered, growing stronger with every heartbeat. You were not made for this. You are a man, not a god. Let it go. Free yourself. Visions flashed before his eyes, a world unburdened, free from the tyranny of hidden truths. He saw laughter, song, the endless horizons of possibility reclaimed from the graveyard of forgotten collapses. It would be so easy. A word. A whisper. A thought. And everything would change. But deep beneath the siren call of his own mind, another memory stirred the oracle's final echo, faint but unyielding. The greatest prison is built not from stone, but from the promises we make to ourselves. Eliot fell to his knees, the silence roaring within him like a caged beast. Tears burned tracks down his cheeks, mixing with the blood and dust of the dying world. His body shook, racked by the unbearable tension between the temptation to surrender and the oath he had sworn in the heart of the void. Around him, the scavengers lurked at the edges of reality, waiting. Their forms shifted with anticipation, ready to pounce the moment the silence fractured. They needed only the smallest crack, the faintest fracture of will. The voice grew desperate now, pleading, bargaining. One word, it begged. One breath. But Eliot understood at last. The true enemy had never been the scavengers. It had never been the collapsing worlds, the hungering void, the dying memories. The true enemy was the weakness inside himself. The part of him that longed to be free of burden. The part of him that could not bear to suffer without reward. And it was that part he had to kill. With a cry torn from the depths of his soul, Eliot pressed his bleeding hands to the ground, forcing the silence back into the core of his being. It fought him, clawed at him, screamed in 1,000 forgotten voices, but he held. He held because to fall would not simply mean death. It would mean annihilation. The voices in his head fractured, splintered, and finally mercifully fell silent. He rose, trembling but unbroken, the air around him crystallizing into stillness so absolute it silenced even the scavenger's hunger. He had chosen. In the heart of collapse, he had chosen silence over salvation. Burden over release. And in doing so, he had become something more than a keeper. He had become a guardian of the end. There was no doorway back, no portal or path. One moment Eliot was surrounded by the fractured remains of the fifth collapse, the next he stood upon the familiar, unforgiving earth of his home world. Yet the familiarity was an illusion, a skin stretched thin over something rotting beneath. The air was too still, too heavy, as if the planet itself held its breath, waiting for something unseen to be born. The sky was not right. It bled faint hues unseen by human eyes, colors that whispered forgotten names against the edges of perception. Clouds twisted in unnatural spirals, forming and reforming glyphs that no living tongue could pronounce. The wind, when it stirred, carried not just dust but fragments of murmured memories, voices of ancient despair slipping through the cracks of time. Eliot stumbled forward, each step dragging an invisible chain of memory behind him. His body moved by will alone, hollowed out by the enormity of what he had chosen to become. He was no longer merely a man. He was a vessel, a prison, a living seal forged from blood, bone, and silence. The world responded to his presence. Small at first ripples at the edge of reality, fractures threading across walls, windows, even the surfaces of rivers and lakes. Cracks that shimmered not with light, but with the dark glow of memories pressing against the fragile skin of the present. In the distance, he saw the outline of a city, towers standing tall against the corrupted sky. But their shapes wavered, twisted subtly with every blink, as if reality were trying and failing to remember how they were supposed to be. And then he heard it. Not the whispers of the oracle. Not the calls of the scavengers. Not the voices of temptation. This was something new. The earth itself, singing. A deep, slow resonance rising from the core, threading through the soil, the water, the blood of every living thing. A song of awakening. A dirge of remembrance. The silence he had fought so desperately to protect was faltering, buckling under the strain of a world too long starved of memory. Shapes flickered at the edges of his vision, people, but not. Shadows of those who had once been, stitched into the present by threads of forgotten pasts. They moved strangely, their motions jerky, their faces blurred, as if trapped between existence and extinction. One stepped toward him, a woman, her features half-formed, eyes wide and empty. She reached out a trembling hand, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Eliot recoiled, but the woman collapsed into mist before he could retreat, leaving behind only the faint, bitter scent of dust and regret. He understood then, the silence was not failing because of external attack. It was unraveling from within. Humanity's hunger to know, to remember, to speak, had never truly been extinguished. It had only slept, and now, emboldened by his journey, it stirred anew, clawing at the thin barriers between past and present, between reality and collapse. And he had brought it back with him. Eliot stood alone at the edge of a crumbling world, the weight of infinite histories pressing down upon his shoulders. He could feel the pull, the temptation to let go, to speak, to unburden himself. But he knew the price. One word. One whisper. One crack. And the fifth collapse would not merely repeat. It would consume. He tightened his grip on the silence, feeling it thrash within him like a wounded beast. The ground shuddered beneath his feet, thin spider webs of memory racing outward, seeking purchase in the fragile present. There was no victory. There was no salvation. Only endurance. Only the terrible, sacred duty to hold the silence a little longer, even as the world he fought to protect crumbled around him. And as the first stars of the night blinked open in the bleeding sky, Eliot Marrow closed his eyes and braced himself for the long, lonely war ahead. The world stood poised at the edge of a whisper. Eliot moved through the broken city, his every step sending silent ripples through streets that no longer remembered their own names. Buildings loomed above him, their surfaces cracking and weeping trails of forgotten memories that ran like veins across crumbling concrete and twisted steel. The sky hung low, bruised with colors that a sane mind refused to name, trembling with the weight of unsaid histories. He could feel the pressure mounting, the silence he had fought to protect straining against its bonds, swelling within him with each heartbeat. The world around him responded in kind. Objects flickered between what they were and what they had once been, streets rearranged themselves in echoes of cities long dead, and faces glimpsed in the corners of his vision blurred, fractured, whispered things that should never be remembered. Eliot knew the danger. He had lived it. He had sworn to contain it. But humanity had not. The whispers had grown louder since his return, seated in the dreams of millions, planted like rot in the fertile soil of forgotten longing. People who had never known the fifth collapse now dreamed its dying screams. Children woke sobbing with memories of skies bleeding stars. The old stared into the horizon with eyes too ancient for their years. It was only a matter of time. And then it happened. A boy no more than 6 years old standing in a shattered plaza, alone amidst the wreckage of a broken world. He looked up at Eliot with wide, hollow eyes, his hands clutching a cracked toy that seemed to flicker between a wooden horse and a blade of blackened glass. And he spoke. One word. A name. A name that had been buried beneath the silence for eons, a name that carried within it the first crack of the end. The moment the word left the boy's lips, reality shuddered. The ground split open in jagged lines, bleeding rivers of impossible light. The air grew thick and sharp, tearing at skin and soul alike. The towers groaned as memory surged upward from the depths, ancient and ravenous. Eliot staggered, clutching his chest as the silence within him screamed, the seals he had built fracturing like brittle glass. He tried to reach the boy, to silence him, to undo the irreversible, but the damage had already been done. The first word had been spoken. Across the world, the same word bloomed in the minds of the sleeping and the waking alike, carried on the breath of every whispered thought, every half-remembered dream. It spread faster than fire, faster than thought itself, consuming language, devouring meaning. He saw it, entire cities shimmering and vanishing into mist, swallowed by the weight of reawakened memory. Oceans turning to mirrors that reflected only the final moments of lost worlds. Forests folding inward, leaves whispering the names of dead stars as they burned to ash. The scavengers returned, not as hunters now, but as heralds, their forms towering and twisted, their mouths wide and empty, singing hymns of annihilation. The oracle's voice, ancient, tired, inevitable, rose one final time within Eliot's mind. It was always going to end this way. He dropped to his knees in the center of the collapsing world, the boy standing silently before him, the name still echoing in the ruptured silence. There was no victory left to claim. No burden left to carry. Only the witnessing of the inevitable. Eliot closed his eyes, letting the storm of unraveling memory wash over him, feeling himself pulled apart not with violence, but with a terrible gentleness, as if the universe itself mourned what it was about to lose. In the end, there was no scream. No last word. Only silence. And then, not even that. Eliot chose to carry the silence, sacrificing everything to protect a world that may never understand the price he paid. But was it enough? The forbidden memory stirs once more, cracks spreading through a world already too fragile to bear its weight. If you were Eliot, would you have chosen to speak, or to stay silent, knowing the fate of existence itself hangs on your choice? Which would be more terrifying, a world without truth or a world destroyed by it? Tell us, what part of this story struck you the deepest? If you were in Eliot's place, would you have made the same sacrifice? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear how you felt walking the thin line between memory and silence. And if you are ready to journey deeper into the mysteries of existence, don't forget to subscribe to the Alien Storyverse for more stories that will challenge everything you believe. Until next time, stay curious, and listen carefully. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words.